loud. Okay. So we're going to get started with our Living Intentionally panel. Not quite the way we planned, but we will be posting this a little bit later and not quite as live as we imagined it to be, but that is 2020. So I am here with Mako, Mandy, and Isaac, and we are going to talk about living intentionally and living in community. So I'm going to basically allow you guys to introduce yourselves. I just led with the names. And what I'd like you to do is we'll just go around. We'll start with Mako, just because I'm going to go in the order of my cubes, and just say a little bit about, who you are, what you'd like to share, and why it appealed to you to be part of this panel. Other than that, I begged you to.
Sure. So I'm Mako Nagasawa. My wife Ming and I have lived at 91 Nightingale Street in Dorchester, Massachusetts for 20 years now. I guess I was inspired by mentors of mine. In Anaheim, California, so I'm a displaced Californian. And when I came to faith in Christ late in high school, I was kind of mentored by this couple, John and Gail Yoshimine, and two friends that they were living with in a suburban house in Anaheim. And I thought they were crazy, but very cool. And it made a deep impression on me for lots of different reasons. Their hospitality, the tamale parties they threw, and someone was always there to teach me guitar. And so, it hit me that I think that's really an amazing way to live. And so when I met my wife Ming and started dating her, that was one of the points of attraction, is that she had had experiences like that in Boston and DC. And so when we got married in '99, we bought this house in 2000, and we had a group of folks to join us. So I was excited just because I think living in community is worth many, many discussions, because there's different flavors and wrinkles and growing pains and learning of lessons and things like that. But I think everything it's worth it. It's at least worth thinking about and talking about.
Great, thank you. Mandy?
Hi, I'm Mandy McLaughlin, and I live in an intentional community in Norwood, Ohio, which is a city within the city of Cincinnati. And it's known as the Vineyard Central community. There's a lot of kind of overlapping communities within the same neighborhood that have blossomed because of the Vineyard Central community. And I say it that way because there are folks who really want to be part of the intentional community, but maybe they don't identify as Christian. Maybe they are more connected to the artist vein that runs through our community, or the parish farming, the urban farming aspect of our community. There's just a lot of different inroads in our community, and so. But it all started in like 1998 as a church plant, and has just gone through some big adventures since then. I always like to acknowledge that living in an intentional community is nothing new. We're trying to get back to our human roots in caring for each other and being cared for. And not necessarily like each other, the people we know, but just the people around us who we live near, regardless of whether they like the term intentional community or even aware of it. I wanted to be part of this community because I had just moved home from India, and I had gone through some really a lot of spiritual turmoil when I lived there. And it ended up being a really beautiful thing. It was kind of rough along the way, but I didn't know it. But this group of people were very familiar with India. A couple of them had grown up there, and they didn't even look at me if I took my shoes off in church, or they understood what I was talking about when I was talking about Indian culture. And I felt very comfortable here because there was a wide variety of faith approaches to faith. And so I had a lot of people to talk to. Some people I agreed with, some people I didn't, but no matter what, I felt loved. And it really helped me relearn how to love other people. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Isaac.
So my name is Isaac Everett, and I also live in an intentional community. Mine is in Jamaica Plain, which is a neighborhood of Boston. And I'm on this panel, I think, because I'm also the executive director of an organization called CRESH, which stands for the Charles River Episcopal Co-Housing Endeavor. And it's a nonprofit that we founded about 3 years ago, because this community where I have lived with my partner for about a decade has been just life transforming for us. And I love it. And I don't ever plan to live it any other way. But we were finding more and more, we were getting way more people wanting to live with us than we could possibly accept. And so a group of us got together to conspire and be like, well, could we replicate this? Because clearly the hunger is there. So like if the bottleneck is not the people, what's the bottleneck? And it turns out the bottleneck is the housing. So we put together this nonprofit, and I've been directing it since its beginning. And in that time, we've launched 3 more intentional communities, one in Cambridge, one in Alston, and one in Dorchester.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. And we're going to get into some questions, but I realized that maybe because of our technical difficulties, I was a little off my game when we started. I didn't even introduce myself. So I'm just going to quickly do that. I'm Elizabeth, and I run the Boston Faith and Justice Network, and this is part of our series of uncomfortable conversations. So we're just trying to convene conversations with people like you guys who have expertise and passion and interest and experience in things that we just want to bring conversations to people about things that we think people should be talking about, and basically be the format whereby these conversations can happen, and hopefully bring information and knowledge and resources and spark things that can lead to some next steps and hopefully more conversations and transformative action would be the ideal outcome from this series for us. So just wanted to share that before we jump in. So I'm going to start with some questions for you guys individually, and we'll go from there. So Isaac, we'll start with you. You kind of introduced your work a little bit, but can you share about that work you do building intentional communities, and maybe explain to us a little bit about intentional communities and why you feel like that work is so important?
Yeah, that is a really big question, and I'll try to do it justice. But there's a whole bunch of reasons that I care about intentional communities. There's the justice angle, and there's the housing angle, and there's the Christian community angle, and they all play into this desperate need for intentional community. In Boston, we have this full-on housing crisis, where we're adding hundreds of thousands of jobs on a regular basis, and we're building new housing at about half the rate that we did in the 1980s. So those two things combined have caused a complete housing crunch here. In addition, as housing prices rise, that means that gentrification happens, communities get displaced, people are pushed further and further away from the middle of the city, but the middle of the city is where the jobs are. And so commutes get longer and people get more and more isolated. And it's just this destructive wave that it just flows out, like poisoning our neighborhoods and our communities as a result of this housing shortage. Co-housing or intentional community is a really amazing solution to that. And it's a very, as Amanda was saying, a very natural and human way to live. It's a very elegant and simple way to live. And it recognizes the fact that our materialist culture wants us to believe that 8 people need 8 cars and 8 bathrooms and 8 blenders and 8 microwaves, but we don't actually. That's a lie that materialism tells us. And when we're willing to share, when you have like 2 cars for 5 people and 1 blender, you can get a really nice blender, as we did. And it's more affordable, it's simpler, it ties you to your possessions less. And I think perhaps most importantly, it lets you live your life in community, in relationship. It makes your relationships and communication and conflict resolution and values and service and neighborhood presence, these become daily things. And that is what really pulled me into intentional community more than anything else, I think. I'm a millennial. And I've heard my generation referred to as a generation that's either unchurched or overchurched. And I think that's really true, is that we're all like either completely done with Christianity or we're really, really into it. And for those of us who are really, really into it, we want it to be a 24/7 thing. What does it look like, to not just have church be a place I go on Sundays, but what does it mean to like wake up in the morning and pad down the stairs in my bathroom and try to live out my Christian values right there? And that's what intentional community has done for me, not just in the financial side and not just the simplicity side, but also in the love and the service and the ability to be in right relationship with other people.
That's there's so much there that I want to like dig more into, but I'm gonna
It's
leave
a big
some.
question.
Yeah, it was a great answer that just had me like, yes, yes, okay, that's so interesting. I like that over church or under church thing too. I'd never not heard that before, but it resonates. But I do want to follow up with a question about the church. What role do you see the wider church playing, or do you see the wider church playing a role in that work of building intentional communities or in supporting intentional communities, or just even just that lifestyle that you're sort of referring to as living intentionally?
Yeah. So there's a couple things. The first is just presence, right? Each of Cresh's intentional communities is built in partnership with the local congregation. So far, all of our partner congregations are Episcopal congregations. We're not necessarily wedded to that. But what it does is it locates the household community within a larger congregational community. And I really think that, if you think about the community is the place where you go to find identity and support and accountability and belonging, and intimacy, then I think that there's sort of layers of community, right? You've got like a romantic partnership, which is your smallest intentional community. You've got your household, which is the people you see every single day without any effort. You've got your congregation, which is the group that you congregate with, right? Could be a church, could be anything. You've got your neighborhood. And these forms of community work best, I think, when they are like concentric circles supporting one another. But we were talking before the call started about moving into an intentional community and people saying, uh-oh, did you join a cult? And the ability to have the doors and windows open of the community and have air flowing back and forth and relationships with your neighbors, to me, that is what communicates that this is not, in fact, cult-like activity. When a cult is going to be trying to cut off your relationships with other support networks rather than encouraging you to have external support networks. So that's the first thing, is just being alongside, partnering with. The second thing is wisdom. The church has got thousands of years of experience of living together intentionally, starting with St. Anthony in the desert, perhaps starting all the way in the New Testament and the Church of Acts, where over and over and over again, they are meeting to worship in their homes. Pretty much any issue you're having in an intentional community, someone's had it before and probably wrote about it, in the 12th century. And the fact that something that our world is so desperately in need of is something that the church has, like, how often does that happen? That's amazing. And the third piece is resources. And I get that question a lot of like, why aren't more people doing this? And the answer is that, launching an intentional community in Boston costs like $800,000. Housing is that expensive. So we tend to aim for doing this in unused and underused church spaces, sometimes historic spaces, because as Sunday attendance shrinks, we're finding a lot of denominations have more real estate than they actually are putting to best use. And intentional community is an amazing way to make use of the resources we have to meet a real need and to do like real ministry in the world. So presence and companionship, traditions of wisdom, and just resources. Those are the three ways the church can be involved.
Oh, that's great. Again, thank you for that. I love that thought of you're going from your smallest intentional community and going out and thinking of the ways those different circles interplay in all of our lives, whether we're living in a real intentional community or not. I don't know how else to put it, like a intentional community or not. We all have communities and we can be intentional or not about them. So that's great. Thank you. Mandy, I'm going to move on to you. Can you share about your experience living in intentional community? Because you're someone who has lived in an intentional community. I don't want to use the word real, in an actual intentional community, and now live somewhat differently. And so can you share a little bit about that experience and the things that you've learned and the ways you translated that experience outside of your actual intentional community house?
Yeah, so I lived in a community house, a huge old rectory from the Catholic parish in this side of Norwood. There were 4 parishes in Norwood and were consolidated in the 90s. And Isaac, many of the things you mentioned like made me think of different aspects of our community, and be it like tiny small examples to like the church building that the community was first started at was an abandoned Catholic church. And there's really, what we've discovered is there has been a sense of abandonment in the city itself. A lot of that came about because the General Motors plant moved out in the late 80s, and our city used to be just like it's called the Gem of the Highlands. It was the most beautiful, wonderful place to live. It was one of the first suburbs of Cincinnati, and it just collapsed when GM left. And I would say that there were pros and cons to that. I don't want people to suffer financially, but along with being considered the Gem of the Highlands, it was also known as the most racist community in the county. And those barriers were also deteriorated when GM left. And so something that we've tried to pay attention to is this feeling of abandonment, but always making sure that we aren't seeing that as something to pity, but something to connect with and identify with, and to identify what areas of our own lives in which we feel this way, and to connect with our neighbors. So yeah, I lived in this community house. We had up to about 17 people at one point in time. I lived there for about 12 years, and I mentioned this, I lived in India before I moved back here and moved into this community. And I think even some things I learned about life in India, about people living close together and depending on each other, and the lack of ability to even have privacy in a lot of cases, it primed me for living in this community. Now, I always had my own bedroom. I mean, often I had my own bathroom, which is luxurious. Sometimes I shared a bathroom with folks, but and I just learned a lot about my rough edges, areas that I thought were important, that other people thought were silly, and vice versa, and how to not. I didn't like it when people thought my rough edges were silly, and so I tried to keep that perspective when I was considering what I thought was silly, and it extended even into my relationships with my family. Isaac mentioned something about like people thought I was in a cult or whatever, and of course my family thought I was. But my test, I was aware of this, and my test for this was, did my family feel comfortable coming and staying in our guest room in the community house? Even my aunts and uncles and my cousins, did they feel comfortable coming and staying with me? Because I truly felt like it was my home. I truly saw it as my home. Answer is, yeah, they did feel comfortable. I think they're a lot happier now that I have my own house, because it's more in alignment with what they know. And really, it was really hard for me to move out of the community house. I actually moved out because the owners sold the house, which was a big change because they were some of the founders of the community. And I think we all grew up a little bit when they left. And they're still our friends, our dear, dear friends. But it was the right time for me to buy the house. And I was talking with my cousin, and I was like, oh, I don't want to move. It just seems like I'm going to be moving so far away. And she was like, well, how far away are you moving? And I was like, 4 houses down the street. And she like almost slapped me. She was like, what are you talking about? Like, get some perspective. You're going to still be near all your friends. And so it was good to have that outside perspective. And so even though I don't live in a home with 15 people, I've kind of extended that community house to all of my neighbors, to the point where I've got a little survivor's guilt during the pandemic, in that so most of my neighbors across the street belong to the Orthodox Church here in Norwood. And the day the pandemic set in, or the quarantine set in during the Orthodox Lent season, and the day after we were told to stay home, we started reading the Orthodox liturgy in their backyard. And they have 4 yards that are all connected. The fences have all been torn down. And since then, we've been standing in the backyard on Sunday mornings reading the Orthodox liturgy. We have happy hours. We celebrate for any reason we can find. And I'm really grateful that that I think we had already fostered a community in which that was kind of ready for a quarantine. We actually thrived in a quarantine. Maybe that's a stretch, but a different aspect that has been challenging in living in intentional community is that everyone knows your business. I'm really good at setting boundaries. I know when to say no. I know when I need to be alone, all these kind of things. And I know how to regulate that with my friends and neighbors. But for example, 2.5 years ago, I was applying to get a traditional mortgage for this house that I live in. And because I've been living in intentional community and having part-time jobs and sometimes not having a job because I was working in the house and was having rent reimbursement, blah, blah, blah. The bank didn't want to give me a traditional mortgage. And I was just mortified. I was 40 years old and I couldn't get a mortgage for a $100,000 house. And I tried twice and they still turned me down. And I was just giving up. And literally in the conversation in which I was just kind of telling my close friends that I was giving up, I got a text from a guy who lives in our community. And he was like, "Hey, I heard you're having trouble securing a traditional mortgage." And I was just mortified. I mean, I can't believe that somebody who lives a couple blocks over knows my financial status. I wasn't surprised, but mortified nonetheless. And in the next text, he said, "I have so many thousands of dollars. I would like to offer you as a personal mortgage. And we'll go through a traditional, we're going to have it all. It's going to be legal through, all of the right paperwork. But I would like to invest this money in you. And you can, it's not a long-term thing. It's just until you can get to a place where you can get a traditional mortgage." And I thought, oh, I would rather, I just wept first. And as I processed it over the next week or so, I realized that I would rather somebody in my own community invest that much money in me than a bank. Now, long story short, well, maybe not. I just got my mortgage refinanced and it's through a bank and it's great. And I don't have that money in my relationship with this friend. But I would rather have it this way. I would rather have somebody hear through the grapevine my financial status than have a sterile bank transaction. Not that there's anything wrong with having a sterile bank transaction, because it's great for the right situations. But in this situation, I grew as a person, and I now know more how I can love other people who may need the same thing from me someday, maybe in a different form. But so Elizabeth, to answer your question, I have moved out of a community house, but I've kind of dragged a lot of those habits with me, just and applying them to my immediate neighbors.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah,
Mhm.
it sounds like there's so much still community in your living that it's a great way
Definitely.
about being in community while not, again, in a actual community house. I'm still struggling.
Mhm.
So thank you for that. Okay, Mako, I'm going to move on to you next, and just ask you kind of in general, what does intentional community look like for you now, and how has it been an important part of your life over the years?
Um, well, first, I really appreciated, Isaac and Mandy, your stories, because for my wife Ming and myself, it's similar in the sense that, like, we own a triple decker, and the kind of the shape of the kind of the types of relationships that we've had and the priorities that we've had for different seasons of our lives have changed, even though, like, we've lived here for 20 years. um, so I think the first phase of our life was connected with, we were just married. Our son came along in September of 2000, right? And so our lives changed. We bought the house and moved in the summer of 2000, and invited all these people who were connected with Ming's campus ministry experience, right? So they're like recent college grads. So to the point of, like, is this a continuation of college life? Like, well, I can understand how people would perceive it that way, because that's
Mm.
a little bit of our experience. Um, but no, I mean, we did a lot of adulting, and we talked through a bunch of things. So one of the highlights of that time was where, one of our friends, who was older, she was a teacher. Um, she was already a single mother. She had adopted an at-risk teenage girl, and so they lived in our house. But she was also the adoptive sister of a boy who was about, I think, 10 years old at the time. And this boy had some special educational needs. Our friend Tisha, decided she was going to quit her job as a teacher in order to homeschool her brother, her adoptive brother, because this was like a decisive time, lots of, like, time to invest in him and also their relationship. And so, as a household community, we all came together and talked about this and said, can we make this work? Well, we were charging below market rents already, but we shared financially, like, this is how much our mortgage is. It's about $2,000 a month. If everyone in our house, like, pitched in another $50 in rent, we could
Mm.
essentially support Tisha, through this whole endeavor, so that she didn't have to work, she didn't have to pay for her room, and we made it work. And then, just a few years later, she was able to move to Milwaukee to join another Christian community, and she had actually saved money during that whole time, and she was able to buy a house within a matter of months of touching down there. So it's just a really amazing time. Also, Ming and I developed a heart for our kids next door who were neighbors, and we didn't enter into a formal foster care arrangement, but we did actually have them live with us because we became friends with the mom. This mom was working two jobs, really tough, really strong person, but really tough circumstances. And so we had her children live here with us, but the whole community really rallied in order to help that happen. Our daughter was born in 2002, and so, for kids to grow up in intentional community, in an intentional Christian community, was amazing. Lots of support. We had lots of help with childcare. We had pretty high standards too, in terms of the maturity, the emotional maturity of people that were part of our household. And then also we had some focus on the neighborhood. So we wanted to offer, different, well, first of all, just relationships with our neighbors. And then we had Bible clubs for kids. In 2005, we helped set up a neighborhood garden, community garden right next door. We turned this abandoned lot into that. Started a neighborhood meetings and neighborhood watch groups and connections and things like that. So that kind of took a season. There was another season where our house church met in our house. And then there's another season now where, we're a little older. We have older folks now living in our house. Ming's parents lived with us. They died in our house. And so we walked with them into that stage of their lives, which was really special. And all throughout it, our kids who are now 18 and 16, and then we have a foster daughter who's 11, have seen and experienced these kinds of quality relationships, and it's been amazing.
Well, that's great. Thank you. That's a lot to unpack. But I want to ask you, in all of that, what role, I mean, it clearly does, but I don't know how you could articulate this in a brief thing, but you don't have to be like super brief, but what role does your faith play in the decisions you're making? Like, it sounds like it's all in there interwoven, but like in terms of deciding to live in intentional community and how you choose to do it in an ongoing way, like how does your faith inform that?
Is that a question to all of us?
That one's still you.
Oh, okay. Well, I think the model that Ming and I had from our mentors was a Christian community, and so there were times we met for prayer and times to talk and support one another. Scripture, certainly we have a document that talks about our core values, and so those are really important to us. And I think conflict resolution is really important, right? I mean, the New Testament talks a lot about anger and conflict and reconciliation, and as well as considerations of situations of injustice and race and culture. And, it's complex, but I would say, one of the most important things is that Jesus' teaching on relationship and reconciliation is at really the center. And I don't know if we'd be able to do it without that core. It's not necessarily that there have been just difficult relationships. They're really, I mean, we've been remarkably blessed and fortunate to have such high quality people. But it does still help to just to have that core of agreement about, like, we are about Jesus. We want him to be reflected here. We're aware for it also that for my wife and I, we're suburban Asian American transplants to a mostly Black community, and we want to be sensitive about how we relate to our neighbors. At different seasons of our household, it's been a multi-ethnic household, and so the quality of our relationships really matters. I think because they're asking, like, well, who are you guys? You're weird. So that really matters. And this point has been raised before. I think in consensus decision making in terms of, in our case, everyone in our household needed to be okay with any new prospective housemate, right? So we would get to know that person. We would ask a lot of questions. Anyone could say, I'm not so comfortable with this person. It happened a couple times, but I think that our commitment to Christ and also kind of the vision and mission and values of our household helped guide decisions about who would be a good next housemate. So yeah.
That's great. Thank you. So now I'm going to move on to kind of questions that anybody can grab, and if everybody wants to answer them, that's great too. We can have multiple answers. So I want to kind of pull up to maybe like a 30,000 foot view. I don't know if that's how high planes fly. I always say that, but I don't really know if that's accurate. Okay. So we've been talking about community living, intentional living, and I guess I'd like for us to define it either or. You can do both and if you want. Like, what does that practically look like? Mako, you sort of started touching on it a little bit, because for those of us who've never lived in an intentional community, like a little window into like how some practical things live out would be interesting and informative too. But also, so you can answer the question that way, and that's interesting. But I'd also like to start thinking about like, how do some of those principles, like how can those get translated into, because I know like intentional living, it's great and the way that you guys are doing it, but I feel like it's not just a practical lifestyle, right? Like the way you guys are talking about it and the way I've understood it from just knowing you, like this is something that is an internal thing that I feel like can be translated, right? And how can we help people understand the ways in which maybe people who aren't in, I'm going to go with actual intentional communities, take some of those ideas into their communities. So you can answer the question either both ways or just, pick one of those sides of that coin.
Isaac, I think you mentioned this was either before the call or during this conversation about resources and having a really good blender. I don't know if that was before or after, but if everybody has a blender, was it before?
I think
No,
it was
during.
the introduction.
Was it during? Okay, I won't repeat what you said then. But I think resources can be a really practical entry point. But even finding out what resources are important to your neighbors takes talking to your neighbors, which to me, like there's some neighbors that I'm nervous about talking about still. Like they've lived here for generations. Like their mom lives down the street and their auntie lives over on the other street. And they're looking at me like, what are you doing here, newbie? And I've been here for 15 years. And so it takes baby steps in communicating, like having little conversations. Like, for example, a community might realize that there's a lot of extra woodworking equipment, and there's a need there's been an interest in learning woodworking skills in the younger generation. And so what does that mean? That you could build a woodworking community workshop where people could mentor others to learn woodworking skills. I think really practical things, like we've seen that happen here in Norwood, and there was kind of a youth group of sorts that grew out of that woodworking community space, because it was just like like if you're putting a puzzle together or you're playing a hand of cards, it distracts you from having to have a conversation with the people you're at the table with. Like conversation flows better. This woodworking, anyway, I think sharing resources is a good way to start. Finding out what those desired resources are that you can share. I love permaculture. I love using available resources and not wasting any available resources. And that has to do in like the food growing, animal rearing community or world. But it has to do with like human interactions as well, and the possessions that we can share. So I don't know. I'm curious to hear what other people think about that. You asked why we wanted to be on this call, Elizabeth, and one is that like I'm just an intentional community nerd. I want to learn from these guys, so I'll shut up.
I think I'd jump in and say, specifically in terms of things that people who don't live in intentional community can learn. Two things that it's really taught me is the first is shared resources. What it's like when, so we had two folks move out right at the beginning of the pandemic. And then as the pandemic sort of built up steam, they're like, you know what, we think we're just going to stay here with our folks and not come back to Boston. And so they reached out to us and said, but we're not sure we can keep paying what we've been paying for like just to store our stuff there because things are really tough for us. And so we got together, those of us who were still in the house, and I was like, well, if things are tough for them, like why, let's just let them leave their stuff here forever. They shouldn't be paying rent. And we've done that many times over the years, just when someone loses a job or someone's working in the food service industry and gets laid off because of COVID reasons or whatever, and just being like, okay, great, we've got your back. Like we'll cover it until you're good to go. And approaching resources from the perspective of like not what's fair, but rather like what do people need. That fairness is not a value that we really hold in the New Testament. We don't hold it here. And that is, and I imagine like what would the church be like if that were scaled up to the congregational level, you know? And we were just like, oh, so someone needs something, great, we got your back. It doesn't matter if it's fair, you know? Then the second thing is that because the question I get most often is how is this different from roommates, right? And I think it's, you know, Mako mentioned a little bit about like sort of having a covenant or a shared agreement, things like that. And the process of intentionally intertwining your lives and really investing in each other relationally requires you to talk about a lot of stuff. And probably the most common misconception I see when people start intentional communities is that they can get by on common decency, or they can get by on assuming best intentions and not realizing, oh, everyone grew up in a very different household and everyone thinks that their childhood was normal, right? And that comes down to everything from how clean does the kitchen need to be, how long can I leave dishes on the counter, how dirty should the floors get before I mop it, how full does the trash get before we take it out. All these things, everyone thinks they know what's normal, but everyone's opinion is different. Down to how long do you let something go before you talk about it? If somebody walks into a common space and you're reading a book, do you set your book down for a moment to acknowledge their presence? Like all these things that like little cultural things that you would think like if we're just relying on our best intentions, no one's going to get hurt because we're all good people. And the answer is no, people are going to get hurt. It's just going to happen. But if you talk about all that stuff, if you lay your expectations on the table, it's like, here's how I grew up and here's what I think is normal and here's where I can bend. Then that's what makes community work. And that's the work that you do when you are living with someone that you expect to be in a relationship with for a very long time. And it's something that most roommates don't do. And that's what intentional community has taught me.
Yeah, nice way to put it, Isaac.
Absolutely. I mean, what temperature to keep the house, you know, like, or that can spawn endless conversation. Elizabeth, what was the first part of your question? I'm so sorry. I know.
Okay, these answers have been so great. Just what does it look like practically, and then how can we apply that outside of community houses?
Try to develop some of these things because I think the part of it is like, what is the purpose of living so close together? Because, you know, in American culture, it is less usual, right? I think people maybe in other cultures have more of an expectation like that this will continue, but so I don't know. I think the I know of communities where they have what's called a common purse, and that to me seemed like too many conversations. Right, because like in our household, at least the way we started, and to some degree continue, we want to have more effective outreach to people in the neighborhood. And so to have a common purse it's certainly possible. I've seen it done. I've seen people kind of get burned out on it too. So it just feels like easier if you like your ketchup in the fridge versus out on the counter at room temperature, then just have 2 bottles of ketchup. Like, so, you know, some things like that are a little easier that way. And so when we think about like, what is the purpose of our living together? What is the purpose of our sharing of resources? Like, I think that helps to have more clarity. In some cases, and this has been true of there's been a minor current in our household, in our community, that's been more of a major topic now. It's how to empower replicating home ownership, right? So when Ming and I first bought this house, we helped one African American family on the 3rd floor move out and put a down payment on a home and they became first-time home buyers. We focused on a certain degree of transparency about our own finances, which has been mentioned already, so that we can kind of help people get out of debt. I have some pretty strong feelings about debt, um, and um, not that the system of debt, not so much like individual people, but that a system that works to keep people in debt is just really harsh. And so we would talk about that. Our household has spun off other people who have bought their own houses, and now there's like a second generation of homeowners now, and because they've seen people live in community, in large numbers in our household, because we maxed out once at 19. I mean, that was crazy. But even if a family moves into kind of a typical suburban house, but has a spare guest room, but can they use that guest room to serve someone like a young adult or a young couple just getting started for a year or two, so that they can pay below market rent, so they can save up, so they can work down their debt, and they can buy a home with a guest room, so that they could do the same thing. Because that is another way of addressing. It's a small way of addressing the housing crisis and the gentrification issues that we face today, especially on the coast. I'm not totally sure in the Midwest or in other places in the country, but I would think that's huge. And from a kingdom perspective, why wouldn't we do that? Because in the long run, if we don't do that kind of stuff, then we're just paying more money and interest to the banks. Why are we helping banks get richer? Fundamentally, we have to ask those kinds of questions. And if living in community is a way to challenge the system, or reduce our dependence on a system like that, in the meantime, we grow relationally, we grow emotionally, we grow pastorally. It's a great way, a great context to exercise leadership gifting, right? Like I've grown more by helping to shepherd our community household more than I have in any position of church leadership, because things happen so quickly and I have to be on my game here. So all these things happen in addition to, like, we can reduce our dependence on the banking system. So I mean, I'll stop there, but because that probably brings up a whole bunch of other questions. But I really like what Mandy and Isaac have brought up in terms of vision and sharing and emotional health and engagement. I think there's a lot of lessons to be transferred and carried over in some ways to folks who are not living in large intentional communities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of your answers give those of us who aren't in actual, community houses so much to think about, and lessons and ideas and thoughts and translated actions, whether it's from replication or reaching out to neighbors or resources. I think all of this is so important to think about, just from a faith-based perspective, from a justice perspective, from a neighboring perspective. I mean, it's all so valuable, and just processing it and thinking about it, and just thinking it's such a valuable conversation. I'm so glad that we're having it. I just want to ask one final question that we sort of talked about before we came on, and Mako, you started addressing it, and just I want to talk about and those obstacles that you see that have either been the reasons that you've wanted to be in community-based living, or obstacles that you see that you're addressing with your community-based living, that you want to talk about those, and how you think it's addressing it, or how you think that maybe there's still obstacles that are there that make it either harder or are the reason that you're doing it. I sort of made that question harder than it needed to be, but I feel like you know what I'm talking about.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think gentrification is a big concern. The housing crisis is a big concern. And, you know, in Boston, it's had a particular flavor of the way in which white supremacy has put obstacles in the way of people of color and communities of color towards home ownership and debt reduction and asset building. And when you do that, then it, you know, as I've heard it said, being poor is really expensive, right? Like owning a home, it's not a silver bullet, and you know, you incur some responsibilities in terms of maintenance and repair and things like that. But just on the level of ownership, you know, you pay less owning than you do renting typically, especially because our tax code incentivizes owning. And so, you know, and there's a lot more to that, but that's something that my wife and I have learned a lot about by living in a Black community. But although we're not African American ourselves, you know, just kind of empathizing, feeling our way through what our friends' experiences have been, and trying to say, is there some small role that we can play towards helping people reduce those obstacles in their own lives? And so, yeah, I gave you a link earlier to a curriculum that I'm starting now with my church, which is mostly Black, Neighborhood Church of Dorchester, and it's a once a month for 12 months curriculum on practical financial literacy combined with what is God's heart from Scripture about shalom and justice, combined with let's really be educated about how racism has played out in the housing and finance industries, because we need to know all those things. And then here are the practical ways that we can respond and engage with that individually and also collectively. So that's exciting, and that's one of the things that I am turning my focus towards more and more.
I think I can sum up like a barrier and also a huge benefit to living in intentional community is the idea of people being dreamers. And from my experience, intentional community draws dreamers. They see this utopian vision that they think is possible, and then they realize that like we're still all humans living close together, and we're just trying to be careful. That's a really summary thing there, but like because it draws so many dreamers, there's I have been burnt, and I've also benefited from other people's dreams and being drawn into them, and maybe they weren't thought out well, maybe they weren't thought into the future long enough, and I've made it through fine. I think I've gained a lot of wisdom through the process, but I know a lot of people who have been hurt by this process, and so I think that's one way I would summarize a barrier that's involved, that's also a benefit of living in an intentional community.
Yeah, I think the biggest barrier is fear, really. Much like Mandy, when we were ready to buy this house for the St. Mary's community, which is a largely Afro-Caribbean congregation in Dorchester, we went to traditional banks and we're like, hey, we want to do this awesome thing. Think about our like consensus-based decision making and our values alignment. And they were like, what now? And we couldn't get a mortgage either. So what we did is we went to a bunch of our friends and allies and talked to people who were willing to take a significant chunk of their retirement savings out of their 401ks and invest it in Creche. Basically saying, if I can get 6% on Wall Street and I can get 4% from Creche, I'd rather put my treasure where my heart is, you know? And both in terms of like the number of people and the amount of dollars, the vast majority of it was raised from people under the age of 40, you know, like not wealthy people, but people who had been quietly socking away money and now were willing to do this. And as a result, we've got like we've got a pair of folks who are, formerly unhoused and now they're living in a house in Dorchester, and it's great. But the banks looked at what we were doing and it's like, this is too risky. There's too much fear to stop me. And similarly, there's like I think it's 100,000 houses in the Boston area that have one or more empty bedrooms. So if you
Mm.
think about the number of beds in this city that are just empty, and those could have people in them in the midst of like one of the worst housing markets in the country.
Mm.
One of the crash houses was actually, it's in the home of a woman in her mid 50s. She's an empty nester and she recently went through a divorce, and she reached out to us and said, I've got more house than I need. Can you help me fill it? And I'm like, yeah, that sounds amazing. And she's so happy now and is living this just joyful, spirit-filled, vibrant life, living largely with people who are about half her age. But that's like really good and healthy also. There's a lot of studies out there that show how you stay healthier and sharper longer if you live intergenerationally. So for those other 100,000 people out there who have empty bedrooms that are not being used, what's stopping them from saying, hey, why don't you come live with me?
Fear.
And
Yep.
it's fear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Absolutely.
good point.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, thank you guys so much. So we will put up the link, we'll put up the Crush link and the link that you had, Isaac's Crush, Mako, to your curriculum. And then Mandy, you had shared a link. Do you want to say what that was about? Because we'll put that up as well.
Oh yeah, there's so much to share. I'm sure there's so much that Mako and Isaac are thinking, oh, if I only had the moment to say this. One of the ways that we engage in the neighborhood is through there's a restaurant called Mariah Pie, and it went for 8 years, and its last Friday was the Friday before Thanksgiving. It has closed. We're all hoping it opens in some flourish next year, but we have to have peace with this at this time. But it's a pay-as-you-can restaurant. All of the ingredients, it was a pay-as-you-can restaurant. All the ingredients were grown in Norwood, except for the flour and the oil and the dairy. And all of the folks who grew the food lived within like 3 blocks of the restaurant. And so you could, like, NPR did a show about it a few years ago, and we had a flurry of out of town guests come. And so that, like, this one evening when I was serving, there was a couple from Seattle who brought like really good wine. And I know this because they shared some with me. And so they were, and they laid down tons of money. We just would give everybody an envelope and you just put in what you want. And we never know, unless you pay with a check, we never know who pays what. And next door to them, or at the table next to them, was my neighbor who I knew was a heroin addict. And I won't go into any more details about her, but she had the same exact welcoming experience and dining experience that this couple from Seattle had. And our goal was, and I didn't found the restaurant. I was just my friends who did, and I was just there supporting it. But their vision was, their motto was that there's always enough. When you live in community, there's always enough. And Isaac, back to what you were saying, like, fear teaches us that there's not enough and that you need to hoard it and not share. But I've learned so much through these friends who opened Mariah Pie. And of course, Mount Moriah is where God provided. And so that's the link that I shared, Mariah Pie. And they're writing a cookbook right now, and that'll be launched sometime in 2021.
Okay, great. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Let me share that. And again, I want to thank you guys. I know we did this a little unusually. We have recorded and we will now post it with these links. Is there anything else you guys want to share before we sign off?
This has been lovely. Thank you. Thanks, Mako. Thanks, Isaac. Thanks, Elizabeth.
It's been great chatting with you and meeting you.
Yeah.
Isaac.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm thankful for each of you. I feel like this has been a very generative discussion. As someone who has never lived in an intentional community, a real intentional community, I have no idea. I feel like I have learned so much, not only about your experiences, but just the ways in which this could be translated, and the ideas and the concepts in which the ways in which you guys have lived and are living can and should be brought about into the Christian community at large, because there's just so much important thinking that I feel like you guys are doing that work, that it's like, okay, then I want to take that and think about the ways in which, you know, that traditional American lifestyle, I feel like we've alluded to a number of times, it's just not, you know, that's not the lifestyle that we're taught. And you know, how are we just accepting that sometimes without thought, because it's just easy and it's there. But
Mhm.
again, you guys are kind of doing some of that hard work and challenging it with the ways in which you're living. And I really hope that this conversation helps us to think about that, to look at what you guys are doing and think, okay, maybe I've sort of lived under some of these assumptions that are not coming out of, you know, Christian teaching, coming out of biblically based thinking, and where do I need to rechart my course.
Mm.
I'm just really thankful for you guys giving of your time and allowing us to learn from your experiences and your knowledge. So thank you so much. And yeah, so this will be up if you guys want to share it and whatever, see how wonderful you were. It will exist on our Facebook page. So thank you all so much, and Merry Christmas and
Merry Christmas.
Merry
Happy New
Christmas.
Year,
Thank you, Elizabeth.
2021.
Yeah.
Yay. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye, friends.